start with a general overview about the project, and this is actually a good spot because I'm going to point out the three sort of distinct components of the exhibition, and then there's so many, I mean, we could talk for hours about the specifics, but I'm not going to do that, so I'll try to cover the general gist of everything and the basics, but do let me know if you have questions about specific things. So this project is something that I was working on for about 10 years. It began in 2004, and roughly sort of phase one sort of wrapped up in 2014, culminating in this exhibition as well as a book, which is on the table here. And I have 30 subjects that I photographed, and they were on every continent. And I worked with biologists, and, well, actually all sorts of different types of scientists. So my background is completely in the arts, so all of the science ended up being sort of self-taught along the way, as was necessitated to understand what it was that what I was photographing. So the idea was sparked on a trip that in part, through a trip that I took to Japan in 2004. And if any of you were at the talk last night, I went into some depth about sort of this experience of creative churn and searching for something both literally and having a sort of sense of just creative searching and I was trying to find a project that I could do that would be that would combine art and science and also philosophical thinking, and all of these things were really interesting and important to me, but it wasn't clear necessarily how I would bring them all together. So I went on this trip to Japan. I had this really interesting experience, and eventually ended up deciding to go visit the supposedly 7,000-year-old tree, and I did not have an epiphany standing in front of the tree, but it was a really important moment for me, and I later, about a year later, was back in New York, having dinner with some friends, telling them this travel story, and that's when I had this moment of all these interconnecting ideas suddenly became clear as a project idea. So and it's a very simple premise. So the idea is to find continuously living organisms that are 2,000 years old and older. And so in part, the idea was this concept of year zero, which sounds a little bit abstract, but the idea is, if you think about it, it's 2015 right now. What does that mean? So human timekeeping is really quite shallow. So why isn't it 4,500,000,000 2015? So in thinking of that, that seemed like a really good way to create some connection to deep time, long-term thinking. So on the more philosophical perspective, connected with hard science. So what I did was a tremendous amount of research to figure out what my subjects even would be. So I originally thought I would find one scientist who would collaborate with me. I thought I'd find an evolutionary biologist who this would cover what their purview would be, the whole scope of my subject matter here. And I quickly found that they recused themselves and said, no, we're not qualified, which was really surprising to me. But then I understood that the way really the sciences are organized, they're drilling down, ever specializing. So what we have here is also things that span all these different kingdoms. So it's not just plants. We have animals. There's the coral. Brain coral is represented here in the show. There's fungi. There's bacteria. So these are different kingdoms studied by different types of scientists. And certainly even in the plant world, we have all sorts of different types. I worked with dendrochronologists and botanists, and so this was something over time that developed. And I was doing research up until and through the last expedition that I went on to photograph. I guess I'm trying to think of what will be the best way to explain. I'll explain really what we have here. So obviously we have the photographs, which represent the most formal aspect of the exhibition, and you'll notice at the bottom of each image there's handwriting. The titles are all part of the work, and that's a really important thing. They're not to scientific field notes, and sort of thinking about the idea of being an explorer, and but so there's a lot of important information in each of the titles, and so they contain the name of the organism, the location. There's a number in there as well. The number is comprised of two different pieces. One, the first part of that number is the date that I photographed, the date when I made those photographs. The second part of the number is a catalog number. That's for me to be able to have made thousands of photographs, so to be able to find and organize the negatives. This is followed by the age of the organism and the location. In some cases, the locations are very specific. It might be something that's very well known. Anybody can find it. In some cases, they're incredibly general, so a state, for instance, but not more specific information than that. It is important to me that I'm being respectful in terms of not driving too much traffic to these things. I'm not encouraging people to go on their own pilgrimages. I mean, there's a very strong environmental component to the work. And so in some cases, I believe we have, yes, there's a eucalyptus right here where I've had to not only not mention its exact location, but also had to redact the species name. So that was an agreement that I made with the scientists there, that if I gave you the species name, you'd be able to track down its location. And so to me, it was more important to actually visit it, make these photographs, let people know that it exists, but certainly not give too much information that would ultimately potentially be harmful. So we have the more formal photographs. Then when we get into this area, you're just going to see all of these different kinds of ephemera and things that have my notebooks. So I always use these black spiral sketchbooks. I've always traveled with them, filled with notes and calendars and sketches and all sorts of things that I just sort of always take with me when I travel. There's all sorts of things that I've collected, so things that I brought back. So there's a piece of malaria fungus, there's a soil sample containing the Siberian actinobacteria, which is the oldest known living thing in the world. It's about 500,000 years old.
Say that again, please.
Oh, so the Siberian actinobacteria. So the and you can find it on the wall over there in the corner, and I'll get to this in a minute. But if you do get asked what is the oldest living thing, that is what we currently believe to be the oldest living thing.
And 500, how many?
So it's
500,000?
It's between 400,000 and 600,000 years old, so roughly 500,000 years old. And I'll go into specifics about that. It is living in the Siberian permafrost, and it was discovered by a team of planetary biologists looking for clues to life on other planets. And so they went there specifically thinking, this is a very extreme environment. What could we possibly find here that could give us clues to life outside of the way that we normally think of biological beings? And so they took a core sample in the permafrost and ended up quite by accident, although with a pretty lucky guess in terms of going to that location, finding this bacteria. And what's remarkable about it is that it's doing DNA repair below freezing. And I know this is very technical, but what it means is that it's not dormant. So even though it's living in temperatures below freezing, it's been living and growing for 500,000 years. So that's pretty remarkable.
Does global warming threaten it, do you think?
So global warming threatens all of these organisms. So different things respond in different ways, certainly. I often use the example of the spruce tree that I believe is at the end of the hallway there, and it's also on the cover of the book. That's a really great visual example of how climate change and global warming is directly affecting these organisms. And in that case, there's that scrubby mass of branches at the bottom of that tree. For 9,500 years, it was only that low-lying mass of branches. In the past 50 or so years, that spindly trunk in the
That's
center.
only 50 years old?
And that's a direct measured effect of the climate zone at the top of this plateau where it lives in Sweden getting warmer. So that's and so I refer to that as a portrait of climate change because you can just visually see it. It's also in this very remote place, so you don't have people, it's not because people have overrun that particular area. It really speaks to the global issue of climate change. Yeah. Yes?
Is the actinobacteria, is that an archaeobacteria or a real bacteria?
It's a real bacteria.
It's not the archobacteria at
No,
all.
it's not. So I'll just quickly say, so the objects here are a combination of things. It's meant to be quite quirky and interesting, and I have my travel books. I have other types, some of the other books that I was reading that were influencing my thinking through the course of doing this work. I have an X-ray down there where I slipped and fell and broke my wrist in Sri Lanka on my way to visit a tree. So these are things that I have in writing in the book, but so I wanted to bring that kind of storytelling and also all of the research and just sort of this just some personal travel experience. I wanted that to be visible to the audience as well, so that's why I've included all of these types of things. And then I also have quite a bit of the research, so if you round the corner you'll see a number of the research papers by the different types of scientists that I worked with. Some of them I worked with directly, some of the papers are older, but that's meant to show another just to expose a layer of how much work and the fact that it is based in real science. That's why these photographs are here. And then on this wall here, you see there's the Linnaean taxonomy, and then these 4 smaller photographs. The taxonomy is a reproduction from the book. These represent all of the subjects that I studied. There's more than 30 because some of these are things that I knew about but haven't been able to photograph yet and aren't yet part of the project. And then what I wanted to do was illustrate, just in a transitional way, how we have these different kingdoms represented. So on the wall I have the 4 kingdoms that are represented, the Animalia, plantae, fungi, and bacteria. And then I'd hand-painted that on the wall to also create a connection between the handwriting on the photos. So again, this work is meant to be experienced on multiple levels. You have the more formal photographs, you have the more scientific information, and all of these other sort of layers in between. And my intention is for people to get, hopefully, interested enough to keep exploring the different layers of the work, because it truly is meant to be seen as artistic, scientific, and philosophical work. So actually I'm curious for this group of docents, what will be most useful to you in terms of other information?
I just want to comment, we've had a few people that are undergraduate age, graduate, and a couple of people that are faculty members come by here and spend the better part of a full day just in this area here, copying your little notes and your notes over there. And I mean really, with a respectful focus, a real tone.
Oh, thank you for
Get
sharing
your
that.
book, and perhaps some of them will be contacting you.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank
Yes.
you. Thank you for sharing that.
Rachel,
That's great.
how do you scientifically age these species?
Oh yeah, so this is a great question.
Yes.
So, yes. So as I was starting to say at the beginning, how I was trying to find one scientist to work with, that quickly became clear that that wasn't going to work. So what I did was a whole lot of Google searching, and so I had to figure out what it was I was looking for before I could look for it. So it was sort of a bit of a chicken and egg, but I created this list, and then what I would do was find a published scientific research paper. Well, that was the ideal scenario, was to find peer-reviewed work. There would be a description of how these ages were determined, and it was different. It's different for different species. Also, I would try to find actual researchers if they were still active, which a number of them are. So I should mention that a lot of the ages of these organisms were discovered in the past 30 years, and a number were discovered even in the course of the 10 years I was doing the project. It varies how the dating is done. So in the case of dendrochronology, you are just counting tree rings. In most trees, that's something that's very possible. It's a very direct relationship. Some of the organisms a number of the organisms here are clonal. So for those without a science background, this was something that I had to learn about. The idea is, for me as an artist, was including everything that was continuously living in an individual sense, but that means both unitary organisms like a single tree and clonal colonies like the quaking aspen colony, which is really a large interconnected root system, but genetically is one organism. So there's no outside genetic information being introduced. In some cases, there's, with the clonal organisms, like I'll give a for instance, in Tasmania, the Huon pine, often it's a multi-layered or multi-stepped process in order to date these clonal organisms. So it usually involves finding a fossilized sample. In the case of the Huon pine, they found some pollen at the bottom of the lake bed, fossilized pollen, that they radiocarbon dated to 10,500 years old, and then did genetic testing to first on the fossilized sample and then on the living colony, and found an exact genetic match. So that's often the case for how the clonal organisms are dated. But the interesting thing about that is that it's a very educated guess, but that doesn't mean that's the oldest existing pollen from, or the, anyway, it just means that this is the oldest we know about. So
still much to be discovered.
absolutely. So if I've learned anything, I've learned so much of the science hasn't been done, and there's a lot of chance to it. So, there's things where, the moss here in Antarctica, the 5,500-year-old moss, the researchers who discovered that happened to see that moss from a helicopter, so they knew that they should go look for that was worth testing. There was another patch of moss on the continent that was found, this was pre-GPS, and it was found once and never found again. And so so through the course of working with scientists and understanding their process a little more, I found, I understand like, oh, well, this was right around the corner from the research station, so that's why you did the research here. Sometimes it's convenient, sometimes it's luck, but we're really just scratching the surface.
So basically you found the pieces that you wanted to look at by Googling? Or?
Yeah, so it began with me doing a lot of Google searches online. And what happened over time was that I got to meet more and more scientists. I would meet with one who said, well, for instance, one of the evolutionary biologists that I worked with on the bacteria said, oh, I happen to be going to Greenland next summer doing some lichenometry with some archaeologists. Do you want to come? Because there's these 3,000 to 5,000-year-old lichens, so of course I did. And so some of it was just by virtue of the fact that I placed myself in the company of people who were interested in the same things. But also as the work started to spread online, I got emails from people all over the world saying, oh, did you hear about this? Did you hear about that? And in some cases they were wonderful tips, and I followed them up and then found researchers who were studying them. So it really took on a life of its own once it started rolling. Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think so. So
hard to give up.
Well, so I have to say that after 10 years of doing this work, it was incredibly intense and expensive and sometimes lonely, and it was a very difficult process. So I would say that it felt quite good to be able to, to create the book was a really interesting thing, because it meant moving from, oh, I'm doing research, I'm going to the next thing, and just you can keep doing, you could just do this work forever, really. But so in creating the book, I had to synthesize this decade of work and say, this is what I want you to take away from it. And it's not to say that the project is over, but for now, I feel like that was the decade encapsulates a finished phase one.
I hope you have a doctorate from all this.
In terms of my background, I actually was working on a doctorate for a while with this project, but it ended up getting in the way of doing the actual work. So I backed away from that.
You got a lot of material to get that
So
citation.
what do you envision going on to next?
So one of the primary themes through this work is the idea of connecting with deep time. So thinking about time in a different way, creating a relationship to long-term thinking, and that's something that is really at the heart of the work for me and is leading to the work that I've just begun. That will be the next work, and that is dealing with deep time and deep space, meaning outer space. Not that I'm planning to go, but in the past year I was part of the LACMA, so this Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the LACMA Lab, which is an art and technology sort of incubator project. And through that was spending time at places like NASA JPL and NASA Ames and SpaceX and CERN. And so basically I'm sort of back at the place where I was a decade ago and trying to figure out what is the right combination. How will these threads of ideas interconnect? And so I have some different ideas. I've just made some photographs out at NASA Ames, but I have some ideas that aren't photography based. So I have some installation ideas, some light installations, and some other ideas brewing. But I've very much enjoyed working with scientists, so I plan to continue to do that. And the theme of deep time and just trying to uncover more of our relationship with our experience of being in the universe and where our place is in that. That's something that in some ways there's some direct relationships to some of the pieces that are here in the show. One of them is the stromatolites in Western Australia. So the stromatolites, they're right over here on the wall, sort of bulbous looking things right down there. So the stromatolites are part biologic and part geologic. They're bound cyanobacteria. And these are really interesting things. I mean, this is not a common occurrence. They're also one of the earliest known living things on the planet. This colony is between 2,000 and 3,000 years old, but the earliest stromatolites are dated back to 3.5 billion years ago. And so once you start talking in the billions of years, you're really into cosmic time. The other thing about the stromatolites is they oxygenated the planet. And so they performed photosynthesis. It took 900 million years. So, I mean, I get chills thinking about it. So for me, and this was I photographed them at the end of 2011, but it was starting to get towards the end of the project, and so my thinking had shifted a bit into the deeper time scales. Another one that's related to space, actually, are the lichens I mentioned in Greenland. That has a couple of things that are worth mentioning. One is that's my favorite statistic of the whole project, and that is they grow 1 centimeter every 100 years. And so that to me is the perfect encapsulation of creating this human connection, the sort of anthropomorphizing these organisms in a way where you can imagine what 100 years feels like. So the idea of that centimeter every 100 years is really remarkable. But the other connection to space is that some astrobiologists recently took some of that same species of lichen, the map lichen or Rhizocarpum geographicum, up into space and exposed them to outer space conditions for 10 days and brought them back, and they returned completely healthy and intact. So this is the study of astrobiology, is looking at the possibilities of life having originated elsewhere in the universe or even in our solar system, and then somehow made it through the atmosphere and piggybacked in on a meteorite or something like that. So there's, I mean, we know so little in that regard, but there's a lot of serious research going on. So, you know, to me, that's part of the through line from this work and what will happen next.
Beautiful. Wonderful.
Any other questions?
Just marvelous.
How did you get it? Did you start as a photographer or start as a biology? I mean, how did you get into?
Yeah, so my background is as an artist, but you know, as a kid I was photographing when I was quite young. I mean, this is something that I've always loved to photograph, but I've also had a very strong affinity to nature since I was very young. And so I actively wanted to engage in an art and science project, in part because, I mean, I think I understand this much more directly now than I did when I began, but artists and scientists are both attempting to explain the world in different ways. And to me, that was a really compelling thing to try to blend the two in a way that was bringing something to both fields, that in some ways, you know, we can be limited either just being strictly scientific or strictly abstract. And so that was really what was the compelling force for me.
You said what you've said about the lichen. Every time I look at the lichen on our walls sitting here, it's still alive. I don't think it's thriving, but it's alive because of our humidity.
Yeah, there you go.
But it's been around a while.
Rachel, talk about the light. Do you shoot midday, early morning,
Oh, that's
late
actually,
afternoon?
thank you for asking that. So I should mention, I didn't mention anything about the technical aspects of the photographs. So I'll just briefly, I mostly shoot on medium format film, so it's 6:7 color film on a Mamiya 7.2. It's a rangefinder camera. It's all natural light. I've never lugged light sources around, and it was important to me that I was trying to capture what was actually there. And I'll come back to the specifics in a second, but just in an aesthetic sense, it was important to me to think about making portraits of these organisms. Some of them are landscapes, and they're meant to be landscapes, but a lot of them are meant to be portraits, and that I'm trying to show the individual, the organism as individual. So in some cases, I had multiple days to return to a subject. Sometimes I had an hour. So, with the case of the Welwitschia, which is the plant in the Namibian desert, I had about an hour, and it was midday in the desert, and so that's the photograph that I made from there. So it was, I wasn't waiting for some, the heroic beam of light or to dramatize it. So I wanted to show the reality of these organisms as much as you would with a portrait of a person. I try to capture some essence of them in a way that feels real, knowing that a photograph is only one small slice of any. There's no one photograph that completely encapsulates the reality of something, but my intention was to show and illustrate the tone that felt like the essence as best as I could. And in some cases I felt that including landscapes, and you'll see in the book that some of them there are many more photographs, some have landscapes that are included with them because it was important to show the context. So if you just saw that lichen, but not the rather sort of prehistoric landscape of the fjords, you wouldn't really get the sense of what that environment was like. So I was definitely sensitive to that in doing the editing.
So depending on what time you arrived, basically, you didn't contrive to get there at a certain morning light or afternoon
It's
light?
quite complicated.
All over the
I would
all over
say
the map.
it was all over the map. So in the case of the Antarctic moth, I think I had about 15 minutes. That image was made from a Zodiac boat on my way back to the ship. There's things bouncing around, hanging on with one hand, bloody knuckles, making a photograph, which was quite different from, spending time in the sequoia forest where I went in the evening, I went in the morning. So a lot of these things were outside of my control. So what I did was try to make photographs that felt authentic to whatever experience I was able to have with them. And I should mention also, so I talked a little bit about time, but I just want to mention this idea of temporal layering, because I think that's an important overarching theme through the work. So we have these layers of time that all sort of exist in this one moment in the photographs. And what I mean by that is, if you think about the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years that it took for these organisms to get to the ages that they are now, combined with the moment that I've gone to photograph them, or you as the audience is visualizing them, or is seeing them now, and that split second of, often shooting in the 60th of a second that it takes to make a photograph, you have all of these, what seem like completely disparate timescales existing in this one moment. And to me that was, aside from the fact that my background is in photography, that's why photography specifically makes sense for this project, because it's capturing time and these layers of time in the same way that the organisms themselves capture these layers of time. So that's a more philosophical and abstract way to think about it, but to me that's one of the more compelling aspects of the overarching body of work.
Reflecting a little bit on Becky, what you really was saying, you didn't want them to tell you, we'll be back to pick you up.
them to tell me that, and they
Did
wouldn't
you?
do it. I wanted to be dropped
No,
off.
that's too risky.
They said it was too risky. It was fine by me.
You're darn right.
Yes. Yeah. Sure. Oh, yes.
Yes, I was just wondering, did you do any work in the deep sea at all?
So I actually did learn to scuba dive for this project, which was one of my fears. So like fear of deep water, so that was something I had to overcome. I have a photograph of the brain coral in Tobago. That's 60 feet. That's not very
Yeah, I
deep.
meant like the hot vents.
I haven't, so they have certainly done research on the extremophiles in the deep sea. I don't know if any of those individually surpass the 2,000-year mark. So to differentiate between ancient species and old individuals, that was a differentiating factor for my subjects. That being said, there are some incredibly deep sea corals that I know about, but would need either a submarine or a remote operated vehicle to image, so maybe sometime in the future that would be possible. But the deep sea, I mean, that's a perfect example of how little we know. There really is very much a needle in the haystack approach to the way that research gets done, so it's such a massive amount of area to cover, so we know so little, especially at those depths. So that's something that I'm open to, but would require a whole different set
Well,
of
I worked at a research
parameters.
institution at oceanography.
Oh, so you know.
So, well, I worked at the aquarium.
Okay.
I mean, hearing you talk and hearing researchers talk about all the research in different
Yeah,
places, I just
yeah.
thought, I had no idea how old some of those things are at the bottom of the ocean, but they could be extremely old.
Well, I know, so there's several, and they're actually in the taxonomy here, a couple of different corals. One is in the Scandinavian Arctic, one is off the Hawaiian archipelago, another is some sponges near McMurdo Station in Antarctica, all of which are far older than the brain coral. Also, those are the only animals in the project, are these underwater creatures. So, I mean, I would love to get to image those because I think, we know far less about them than a lot of the other things that
Well, maybe I
appear
can
on the
get your card
surface.
and bring it back to the aquarium.
Oh, thank you. I'd appreciate that.
I love that.
Okay, great.
So is there a book two?
There could be. I'm not going to count it. I won't discount the possibility.
Second edition, third edition.
Yes, there certainly could be. Yeah.
Do you know what you're doing next, or are you like on a?
Well, so the space.
Space.
Yeah, yeah. Going to space.
Oh, you're.
I'm not going.
Unless they come back to pick you up.
That's a long-term commitment.
That's it, right. I'm not going to Mars.
Well, I just sort of discounted, I heard you say that, but I just thought, well, you don't really mean that you're going to go.
I don't. I mean, I think it's more possible than it ever would have been before, but I don't see, for me, the travel, there has to be a really compelling reason to physically go, to use the resources that it would require for that. And if there is some reason, I won't count it out, but it's not, for me, it's not just the sense of this, manifest destiny. It's more that I want to create a more direct relationship between these ideas and through the mediation of artworks.
Your show seems like such a profound teaching tool, so I hope that you're scheduled to take it all over the world. That would be one of my hopes for
Well,
you.
thank
is
you.
that-
Appreciate it.
that
Working
you-
on it.
Yeah, that you can be out there and sharing this kind of knowledge, because I don't want to go traipse into the island in Japan that takes, 5 days to get there. So thank you for doing that hard work.
Thank
Wait,
you.
was this, you on a grant, or how did you afford all this?
Right, I mean, that's a really excellent question, and it could be a whole other discussion about how the arts are supported in this country. I went into a lot of personal debt to make this work. I did get grants along the way, but not nearly enough. I did things like a Kickstarter campaign early on, and other types of benefits. But I still now have credit card debt from the making of this work. And then I was very fortunate to get a Guggenheim grant this past year, and which I thought, I could pay myself back with that, or I could make these photographs for this exhibition. So you can see which direction that I went in. So yeah, I mean, it was not, it was a labor of love and something that I certainly don't regret in any way, but it was and still is a financial burden.
That beautiful story of yours in the Wall Street Journal, I think.
Oh, yeah. Well, so, I mentioned in the book, there's a certain cognitive dissonance to being featured in the pages of the Wall Street Journal and unable to pay my rent at the same time. And I think it just speaks to, we don't have a sense of what it takes to be an artist and the kind of dedication and resources that it requires. And also that being in the press is not the same as being funded. So it's an important distinction.
Good luck. Bravo.